In today's lecture, we will talk about metabolism in plants. We will be talking both about how plants store energy and how they release energy. Implicitly, the important process in storing energy is going to be photosynthesis, and the process that we'll talk about most with energy release will be respiration. We will start by defining autotrophs and compare it to heterotrophs. And these are different strategies for acquiring carbon to make organic compounds. The terms also relate to different strategies for getting energy to make these compounds. We will talk about how plants store energy in either carbohydrates or lipids. We will talk about the process of acquiring carbon and acquiring energy to make glucose. That's, of course, photosynthesis. And we'll compare that to the strategy of how plants break down glucose to release the energy to perform cellular functions. That process is respiration. We will go a little bit into chemistry to talk about oxidation-reduction reactions. This is basically a fancy term for reactions that move electrons from one compound to another compound. And electron exchanges, we'll see, are really important in both photosynthesis as well as respiration. We will talk about ATP, which is a molecule that plants use, well, plants and all other organisms, for short-term energy storage. And in total, all of these topics are going to give us an overview of photosynthesis and respiration and leave us prepared to talk about both of those in more detail in subsequent lectures. Metabolism is a general term for all of the chemical reactions that occur within a living organism. Some of the most important reactions are those that are involved in energy storage or energy release, because almost all other cellular reactions will require an energy source. So it's important then that the plant or other kinds of organisms have a way of accomplishing this. We will also, in metabolism, there is going to be a large focus on reactions that exchange electrons, and these were the oxidation-reduction reactions that we just mentioned previously. There are many reactions that either build up or break down macromolecules. This would apply to building glucose and also disaccharides or polysaccharides, but this would also apply to building nucleic acids like DNA or proteins or lipids. And then there are other metabolic reactions, less related to building molecules and more related to sending or receiving signals. We won't be focusing on those, but I wanted to include it in the list. And there are some other things cells do that we won't talk about here. We will focus in on different strategies for obtaining energy in materials. Generally, if an organism wants to build an organic molecule, it will need three things. First, it will need an energy source to accomplish this. Second, and related to this, the organism will need a source of electrons. Third, because organic molecules always contain multiple carbons, the organism will need a source for that carbon. There's two general strategies to accomplish this. The first strategy is being an autotroph. And autotrophs will acquire carbon from carbon dioxide, and in most cases, they will acquire the energy they need from sunlight. There are some exceptions to this that acquire energy from non-organic chemical sources. I am not going to worry about those for our purposes. So for our purposes, we'll focus on the autotrophs that use carbon dioxide and sunlight in order to build sugar and eventually other organic molecules. In contrast, heterotrophs are organisms that acquire their carbon, and they typically acquire their energy as well from already existing organic molecules. And remember, we've defined this in other lectures, but organic molecules are complex molecules that already have multiple carbon atoms. So when a heterotroph acquires some of these molecules, it will break them down in the process that will release energy. The heterotroph can then use that energy for its needs, and it can use the carbon that's released to build new molecules. Autotrophs and heterotrophs occupy different levels in a pyramid. Different feeding levels are referred to as trophic levels, and so we can refer to this pyramid as a trophic pyramid. And in a pyramid like this, the bottommost level will be the autotrophs, and that can be plants as diagrammed here, but this can also include photosynthetic bacteria like cyanobacteria. It would also include our photosynthetic protists, which remember are the same thing as algae. So if you remember, we talked about diatoms and green and red and brown algae. All of those would be at this trophic level. Of course, nearly all plants are going to be photosynthetic and would also count down here. There are just a few plants that are parasites and would occur at higher trophic levels. Then everything above the plants are called heterotrophs. And this is going to include anything that is eating other organisms or absorbing organic compounds that were made by other organisms as their way of getting energy and carbon. So this would include non-photosynthetic bacteria. It would include non-photosynthetic protists, in other words, the protists that are not algae. It would also include fungi and animals. Down here at the bottom of the pyramid, we see some organisms that are involved in decay. Things like earthworms, some soil arthropods, and also fungi. Even though these are represented down beneath the pyramid, they actually are still going to be heterotrophs because they are using organic compounds as their energy source, and they are getting their carbon from those compounds that are decaying as well. That is a little bit then about how different kinds of organisms acquire their energy. We next are going to talk about how do cells store energy, and we are going to focus on plant cells. Short-term storage in all organisms is ATP. We won't worry about what it stands for, but this is a small compound that is used only for short-term storage. It is extremely important because it powers almost every cellular reaction. And this will be true in everything from plants, bacteria, animals, etc. So ATP is basically universal. ATP has two forms. The high energy form is ATP. The low energy form is ADP. And the difference between these is described in your reading. Basically, one phosphate is broken off from ATP to become ADP. I am less worried about that. I'm more worried that you know that ATP is the high energy form and ADP is the low energy form. This means that if we have a reaction where ATP becomes ADP, then since we are moving from a high energy to a low energy form, this must release energy. Conversely, if we have ADP and we make ATP, then because we're moving to a higher energy form, we will be storing energy when we do this, but we will also need an energy source to accomplish it. ATP is a great way to store energy in the short term, but ATP is not a very stable molecule, so the cell cannot use it for long-term energy storage. Instead, other things are used in the long term, and then ATP is made before it is needed from those other stored sources. For plants, there are two major categories of macromolecules used for energy storage. These are carbohydrates as well as lipids. Between the two, carbohydrates are more important than plants. And there are two general forms that are used for this. The first is sucrose, which we talked about earlier in the semester. Recall that sucrose is a disaccharide, meaning it is made from two sugar monomers, and you can see the structure over here. Recall there's a glucose and a fructose. Remember that sucrose is, in fact, table sugar. Sucrose has some good qualities for use in plants. It is relatively easy for a plant to transport it from cell to cell. It is able to dissolve into water, and so it can be transported through the cytoplasm and through openings between cells fairly easily. It is not a great way to store a lot of sugar in the long term, however. This is because it dissolves into water. That means that if the cell has a lot of this, then that can change the concentration of dissolved matter in the cell, and as we talked about in the water lecture, having more or less dissolved material in the cell affects whether water wants to move into that cell or out of that cell. And so this can sometimes interfere with where a plant wants to move water. For this reason, most plants do not use sucrose as the primary way of storing excess carbohydrates. There's some exceptions to this. Onions, for example, tend to use a lot of sucrose, which means that onions are sweet. Now, of course, onions can also be pungent, but if you have an onion that you've cooked to get rid of the pungency, you'll notice that it is sweet. Or if you buy something like a Vidalia onion or another sweet onion, then you'll notice that it is sweet even without that pungency. So we've said that sucrose is sometimes used for long-term storage, but that most plants use other molecules. The most common molecule for long-term storage in plants is starch. And we talked about starch when we talked about macromolecules. We said it's again a carbohydrate and it is a polysaccharide. And so here's a diagram. You can see glucose. Each one of these sets is one monomer of glucose, and those glucose get linked together in a long chain. We said in our previous lecture that this long chain will take on a helical form like pictured here. And what we can see in this diagram is that starch molecules will occasionally branch, so they're not just straight, but they will have branches too. Because starch can form this helical shape, it is compact. And because it compacts, it's going to interact less with water in the cell. As a result, it will have less of an effect on water balance in the cell than would sucrose. For these reasons, most plants use starch as their primary storage molecule. The other possibility is storing energy in lipids, and specifically oils. So let's just note that oils, in fact, are a category of lipid. And there's some benefits to using lipids for storage. First, they store more than twice as much energy per gram as do carbohydrates or proteins. So if it's necessary to store a lot of energy in a small amount of material, then they are very useful. However, there's also some problems. First, they are less stable than carbohydrates, so they are more inclined to break down spontaneously in the cell. Second, they are hard to transport cell to cell because, as you know, lipids are not water soluble, so they do not like being free in the cytoplasm. Because plants oftentimes need to move their stored energy from the roots up to the shoots to make new leaves, or from the shoots down to the root to the roots when the plant is photosynthesizing, it would be hard to move a lot of lipids around. For those reasons, plants tend to use carbohydrates instead of oils. However, there are a couple of places where oils are used. The first is they are very commonly used in seeds. This is because seeds need to be small in order to disperse. If they are being dispersed, let us say by wind, then a small seed will disperse more effectively than a large one. Or even if they're being dispersed by animals, the animal might be more willing to eat smaller seeds and less willing to eat large ones. Additionally, we will see that there's long-term energy storage of oils in some fruits. Most fruits, in fact, are heavy on carbohydrates and have little oil. There are some exceptions. The two that we think about most are olives, which of course are very oily, and then also avocados. In these cases, the plant is not storing energy in the fruits, so the plant can use it at a later time. Instead, it is storing energy in the fruits to entice an animal to eat that fruit. Animals like high-calorie snacks, so by storing their energy in lipid form, then it creates a better meal, and perhaps animals will be more likely to eat it. Now, a plant wants the animal to eat the fruit because there's a seed associated with the fruit. Of course, they're missing here because we have removed them from olives. But if an animal were to eat the olive with the seed in it, then the hope of the plant is that the animal will digest the fruit, but the animal will defecate out the seed, which will then allow the seed to start growing in some new location. We now will switch gears a little bit. We've talked about how plants store energy, but we need to talk about how plants acquire energy and carbon. The process that begins this is, of course, photosynthesis. So this is the process of acquiring energy, carbon, and electrons in order to build sugars. The requirements then for photosynthesis is sunlight or some other light source to use as an energy source. Carbon and oxygen are necessary, as you know, based on the formula for sugars. And the carbon and oxygen, it turns out, will come from carbon dioxide in the air. Additionally, the plant is going to need some source of additional electrons to use in building its sugar. That source of electrons will be water. Let's just remind ourselves that sugars have carbon as well as hydrogen as well as oxygen. So as we said, carbon dioxide, which has carbon and oxygen, supply those, and electrons from water as well as protons that are already in the cell are going to be providing the hydrogen. Let's go over the general formula for photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is going to start with carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide will be combined with water. The result will be that the formation of glucose and oxygen will be released. So the important product here is the glucose. Remember that carbon dioxide has only one carbon in it. That means that carbon dioxide counts as an inorganic carbon. And organic carbon always has at least two carbons connected in some more complex molecule. That means in the process of photosynthesis, we are going from inorganic carbon and we are fixing it into organic form. Glucose counts as an organic carbon because there are 6 carbons as well as other atoms in a glucose molecule. The oxygen that is produced in photosynthesis is really just being made as a waste product. That is a summary of photosynthesis. We will also go over now a summary of the process of respiration. Respiration is basically the process of photosynthesis in reverse. So if glucose was made during photosynthesis, then glucose is broken down during respiration. And if carbon dioxide and water were the reactants in photosynthesis, then carbon dioxide and water are the products of respiration. Photosynthesis required energy to occur, and so respiration releases energy. And photosynthesis released oxygen as a waste product. That means that respiration is going to require oxygen as one of the reactants or one of the ingredients. We can see that the two processes are the reverse of one another if we look at their two formulas. So on the bottom here we have the formula for photosynthesis, which we've already talked about. Carbon dioxide plus water yields glucose plus oxygen. And I've also recorded the chemical symbols for each of these. This is not a balanced equation. For example, we would need 6 carbon dioxides for every glucose. I'm not too worried about that here. I just wanted to remind you of which atoms are in each of these kinds of molecules. So here's the glucose and oxygen products. Let's now look at respiration. We have glucose and oxygen as our reactants. And in photosynthesis, here's the carbon dioxide and water that are the reactants. In respiration, carbon dioxide and water are the products. Before we can get further into how photosynthesis and respiration works, we need to talk about oxidation-reduction reactions. These are chemical reactions that involve exchange of electrons. And this will be very important because building a molecule necessitates that electrons are added to it, and breaking down the molecule is going to involve removing electrons from it. The term for losing electrons is oxidation. Reduction refers to when a molecule gains electrons. Now, electrons always go from somewhere to somewhere else. That means we can never have oxidation happening on its own, and we can never have reduction happening on its own. Instead, whenever there's an oxidation, somewhere nearby there must be a reduction, and vice versa. I will also point out, as we talk about oxidation-reduction reactions, that sometimes only electrons will move, but very frequently we'll see that along with those electrons, a proton gets transferred as well. Sometimes entire atoms are transferred as well as the electrons that we are following. And we'll see then some examples, especially where hydrogens move around. And when a hydrogen gets lost, we'll refer to that as an oxidation. When a hydrogen gets added somewhere, we will consider that an example of a reduction. Here's a diagram that shows schematically an oxidation-reduction reaction. So we have some molecule here, this, 10-sided shape, and you can see it has a hydrogen attached to it. This plus-minus symbol is just to remind you that really a hydrogen atom is just a proton and one electron. A hydrogen is one proton and one electron attached to each other. In this example, this shape is going to be losing that hydrogen, and it's going to get transferred to this green diamond shape. So over here, you can see the attachment. And then when we look at the product side of this reaction, the hydrogen has now been lost from this many-sided shape, and it has become attached to this diamond shape. That means the many-sided shape has lost an electron, and therefore it has been oxidized. Conversely, the diamond shape has gained this electron, and therefore it has been reduced. It's true that the multi-sided shape also lost a proton, and the diamond shape also gained a proton. So that's happening. We just aren't going to mention it in the terminology. Oxidation-reduction reactions are very important in cells. And because of this, cells have some specialized molecules that are really just present to carry electrons from one place to another or to store electrons in the short term before they are needed. And different carriers are used for different functions. So one carrier is called NADP+, and this is going to be a carrier of electrons in photosynthesis. This is not actually true but the way I remember this is that the P in NADP stands for photosynthesis. A different but very similar carrier called NAD+, is going to be important for carrying electrons in respiration. And of course, respiration does not start with a P. There's no P in the term NAD. We're going to talk a little bit now about the role of oxidation and reduction in photosynthetic reactions. So in photosynthesis, remember that carbon dioxide, CO2, is going to be acquiring many hydrogen in the process of forming C6H12O6. You can see there's 12 hydrogens here. Also remember that the hydrogen is just an electron plus a proton. That means that during the process of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide will be gaining electrons, and therefore it is being reduced. The electrons that are going to be used to reduce carbon dioxide are going to be pulled off of water molecules. When those electrons get pulled off, then the hydrogen ions, or the protons that remain, will also come off. And so the H's basically are going to be leaving the water molecule. The result of this is that water becomes oxidized. It loses its excess electrons, and oxygen is the only thing left, the O, and so oxygen is released. Now there's only one oxygen in the water molecule. There are two oxygens in molecular oxygen, which is the oxygen we would breathe. So basically, what has to happen is electrons have to be pulled off of two water molecules, two single oxygens are formed, and then they can combine together to form O2. So the summary of this is that carbon dioxide is being reduced in photosynthesis, and water is being oxidized into oxygen. Let's look at the role of oxidation and reduction in the process of respiration. In respiration, we are going from glucose, C6H12O6, to carbon dioxide. You can see that glucose has hydrogen, carbon dioxide lacks it. That means that in this process, we must be pulling off electrons from glucose. If glucose is losing electrons, it is becoming oxidized. Those electrons that are pulled off of glucose eventually are going to be given to oxygen in the process of respiration. This means that oxygen is going to be gaining electrons, and gain of electrons is reduction. So the oxygen will be reduced. And when this oxygen gains electrons, then it will also pick up some protons from the water. The result of that is that it will be able to form H2O, or new water molecules. Since there are two oxygen here, I'm noting that that would give us two water molecules for each molecular oxygen. We've then talked about the role of oxidation and reduction in both photosynthesis and respiration. Next, let's talk a little bit about the role of ATP. Remember, ATP was our short-term energy storage molecule. And we'll talk about its role in photosynthesis first. Remember that in photosynthesis, we are building glucose. Glucose is a complex molecule with a lot of electrons attached, and so this is going to require an energy source. The ultimate energy source for this process is going to be energy from the sun. But to take that energy from the sun and build glucose, the first step will be making ATP. Once that ATP is made by the cell, then the cell can spend that ATP to power the reactions that create the glucose. So ATP is going to be essential in this process. Next, we'll look at the role of ATP in respiration. So not surprisingly, what we're going to see is the reverse of what happens in photosynthesis. In respiration, recall, glucose is broken down. The result of this is that energy is released. Well, why is the cell breaking down glucose? It's doing it so it can capture that energy and use it for cellular function. but it can't do that in one step. Again, ATP is going to be our intermediary. So as glucose is broken down, energy is released, and that energy is used to make ADP, that low energy form, into ATP, the high energy form. That ATP then will be used to power whatever processes in the cell need to be powered. That is the end of our summary of photosynthesis and respiration. I want to acknowledge that these processes are quite complex, and really what we've done here is just go over the basics. I expect it's a little bit confusing, and that's okay. If you look ahead on the syllabus, you'll see that our next lecture is going to be only about photosynthesis, and we will review photosynthesis again, and we'll go over it in some more detail. We'll also talk about how plants can capture energy from sunlight using pigments in order to power that process. Then in the lecture after that, you'll see we are going to focus exclusively on respiration, and we'll talk in much more detail about how the plant can take glucose and break it down in a way that makes ATP available. Let's end with some final thoughts. First, basically all cellular functions are going to require an energy source. That means that a really important thing for the cell to be able to do is to store energy, for example, by making ATP, glucose, sucrose, or starch, or conversely, taking those sources of stored energy and making them available by breaking them down first from complex molecules like starch into monomers, and then in the process of respiration, breaking that monomer down into simpler forms and using the released energy to make ATP. Also, you've probably focused in high school courses on the energy that is needed or released in the processes, but it's just as important to keep track of where electrons go. So when building molecules, electrons are needed, and when breaking down molecules, electrons are made available for other molecules. Because these are important, it means that thinking about what is an oxidation reaction and what is a reduction reaction is going to be important to understand what is happening. The last thought I will leave you with is that photosynthesis and respiration really are the reverse of one another, with just a few exceptions to this. This means that if you can master what happens in respiration, you should have a pretty good idea of what happens in photosynthesis by just reversing the process. And the same thing is true if you understand what happens in photosynthesis. As I said, stay tuned for the next 2 lectures, and I hope by the end of that both processes are clear to you.